I'm Jay, and I'd like this session to be interactive. I've been allotted 20 minutes, so please feel free to stop me and ask me any questions if you have any. That way we can keep it a little more interesting. And I'll try and share some stories with you and my own experiences so far in this, in my journey. So yes, I am a practitioner of the law, as Diksha mentioned. Thank you. And Diksha, right? Thank you. And a litigating lawyer based in Delhi. I am, of course, very excited to be here today. And I'm going to talk to you about the legal profession and success, the idea of success in the legal profession, but in the sense of it being meaningful, your journey in the legal profession being meaningful, and with the end goal, which is why I said what is the point of it all, the end goal of finding satisfaction in what you do. Once you graduate from law school, you enter the profession, and this applies to everyone across the board. You could enter the transactional field of corporate law. You could get into litigation like I ultimately decided to get into. It could be academia, publishing. It could even be in-house practice. I mean, in-house work with a corporate entity. But your most important objective, according to me, has to be satisfaction, right? You have to love what you do. Otherwise, it's going to be a rather long, monotonous, very boring journey for the next 60, 70 years, or whatever, 70 years, because there's really no retirement age in the legal profession. So the idea is to design a purpose and a calling in life that leads to happiness and not disillusionment. So those were my ideas that I wanted to share with all of you today. Now, the overarching theme is satisfaction and how you get to it and professional satisfaction. And the idea is, I will, at this point, stick my neck out and say this, that a lot of you guys, when I was your age and, younger and in law school, third year, fourth year, fifth year of law school, the prime motivators for getting into this profession were a little different for me, different from what it is today, but different for my colleagues and friends who were in law school with me as well. That a lot of my friends in law school, when we would be sitting under the tapri in ILS, everybody would discuss what their ideas were and why they got into the legal profession, and they wanted to practice law. So wealth was one. A lot of people said that we want to make a lot of money. A lot of people said power, that they want to acquire power, as you said. And the other third thing was in terms of recognition, right? Do you want to be well known in what you do and make a difference publicly and so on? So these were the three overarching things that one heard repeatedly: wealth, power, recognition. But what I want to tell you is this: even if these are your desires, and nobody is shaming you for having these desires, and it's perfectly all right, whatever motivates you, the idea is that the outcome and whether you will achieve these ends will depend largely upon your professional satisfaction in terms of being really happy with what you're doing and doing it in a way that brings you a lot of joy every day when you get to work. So these other three attributes are byproducts of the first thing. But before I begin, I'd want to acknowledge what an incredible honor and indeed privilege it is for me to have been invited here to address all of you. You are, of course, amongst India's most promising law students and future leaders of the legal profession. I know this because Bhumika told me that there was also a very rigorous threefold interview process before you guys could, before you were picked. What I want to say is that it's, getting appointed as SCC student ambassadors. Don't just treat it as a very prestigious mark on your CVs. Don't treat it just like that. Of course, it is very prestigious. But it can give you a massive advantage in terms of the exposure and learning that you will get out of this experience. Coming here, meeting other students, listening to, people who came here and spoke to you, and meeting other practitioners. So the honor in terms of addressing you for me is also compounded by the fact that I have been given this opportunity to talk to you, and it's a very important responsibility, by perhaps one of the world's most respected legal brands. There's undoubtedly. And the SCC, the EBC group, is an institution in its own right, the hallowed Eastern Book Company. Of course, they're also my book publishers, which is very important for me. And the EBC name is also synonymous with a very powerful three-letter abbreviation that is known literally without exception, in every courtroom, in every classroom, in every judge's chamber, in every law firm. And those three words, of course, are SCC, right? And right from trial courts up to the Supreme Court of India, they are the undisputed giants of Tilak Marg. So it's a great privilege for me, and thank you. Big thank you to the Maliks for having me here and for inviting me. And very grateful to you. So now I go on to the second aspect of what I wanted to really talk to you guys about, which are two stories which I'd like to share with you. And these two stories tie into my journey so far and what has brought meaning to my professional journey as a lawyer. And one thing I picked up from this is that while you're practicing, the day-to-day, challenges, while you're engaging with the day-to-day challenges of your legal work, attending to clients' needs, appearing in different courts, is there something more you can also do in addition to your regular work, which will bring you more satisfaction? That is the idea that I want to share with all of you. And for me, that idea is that how do you learn to weaponize the Constitution to actually do good? And we grapple with it, we study it in law school, we read about cases where constitutional principles have been operationalized. But how is it that you as young people can in fact bring it within your own realm of experience and within your own practice to be able to do good, to supplement whatever it is that you decide to ultimately do, be it in law firms or as litigating counsels, in whichever path you decide to pick. So let me dive in with a very interesting story that determined the course of my own professional journey so far. This was the summer of 2011. Now, a lot of you might have still been in school then, I'm guessing, and middle school and so on. But if you think back to 2011, this was the peak of the Anna Hazare anti-corruption movement, right? You had India Against Corruption that was doing dharnas in every corner of the city. I had just come back as a fairly newly minted lawyer. I'd just graduated from Pune, from ILS, and I'd come back to Delhi. And I joined a large law firm. And one of my friends at the firm told me about this meeting that was going to happen at India Against Corruption, where other like-minded young people were going to come together and talk about these issues that we were all deeply passionate about: corruption, probity in public life, and so on. And those were different days. Those were different times when every other day you would hear about some scam coming out and all sorts of things. So this message by Anna Hazare and the India Against Corruption movement, it was an inspiring message, and it was something that we could all rally around regardless of whatever our political affiliations were. And importantly, at that time, this was an apolitical movement. Aam Aadmi Party didn't exist then. It hadn't yet come out of India Against Corruption. This was just an NGO that was basically raising awareness about issues of corruption. So we would go and attend these meetings, and invariably as a young person, you met other young people and you made friends. And I met a very interesting character at one of these meetings. And as I said, this is 2011. I'd just gotten into the legal profession, was learning the ropes at a large firm. And I met a young man called Nipun Malhotra. And he's a very dear friend of mine today. And Nipun suffers from a very rare congenital disorder known as arthrogryposis. Now, what this basically means is that Nipun is otherwise physiologically completely normal. I mean, he's as normal as any of us. And a congenital disorder basically means that when you're in the womb, in your mother's womb, something doesn't go right in terms of how we define normal. And there is, you could be born, congenital disorders have a spectrum. So you could, let's say, be born with an extra digit, or unfortunately in the case of Nipun, it was a severe locomotor disability, which means that he has no limbs in his, he has no muscles in his limbs. So he's permanently wheelchair bound. So that is what Nipun, unfortunately, the condition he has. But he's one of the funniest, one of the most brilliant people that I had met. He went not on reservation, because there's no disability reservation in India for education. He went to St. Stephen's, got his undergrad in economics from there, then did his master's in economics from Delhi School of Economics. So by all accounts, a very, very sharp young man, and with a great sense of humor. And a very self-effacing sense of humor. Because, when you're born like this, and you've gone to the best places to study, and you meet other young people, you have to be able to take your own condition with a pinch of salt. You have to be able to laugh at yourself and really get on with life. And India isn't exactly the most sensitive of places to deal with a disability like this. So I learned a lot from Nipun about life in general, about challenges, and we would meet socially. A lot of our friends from this India Against Corruption cohort, like you're all meeting here now, I'm sure a lot of you have become friends, and we'll meet later. Whenever we would meet socially, and we would be a fairly large group of seven of us, Nipun invariably would not be able to attend. Why? Because either the place would not be accessible, there would be stairs. Most restaurants in Delhi did not have stairs, in Connaught Place and other places, where young people like to go after, to the gym, of course. I mean, after going to work all day. So you'd want to go and you'd want to socialize. So he couldn't go. The other problem was, on days when he could go and places were accessible, he would have issues of transportation. There would be no publicly available transport which was accessible and that he could use and he could come and utilize. So these were issues that we faced, and we just accepted them. We thought, well, this is India. There's really not too much you can do, and we accepted it. Now, a few years go by, we become better friends, and I came back, finished my work in the US, I came back to India, got into practice, and Nipun and I were sitting and having a cup of coffee in Meherchand Market, right here near Lodi Road. And we were going through, we were having our coffee, and we were going through this newspaper that was lying there. And there was a small notice there. It was a tender. A tender had been announced by the Delhi government, the DTC, to order buses in Delhi. Because this was the time in 2016 when buses had to be ordered in Delhi because, the old DTC fleet had to be made redundant or whatever. So this bus tender we saw, we went through it, and it caught our eye that these were standard floor buses. These were not low floor buses, but standard floor buses. So Nipun explained it to me. And I asked him, I said, what does it mean? So he said, well, low floor buses are difficult to get onto, but there's a ramp. So the distance between the floor, the ground, and the bus is not that much. So it's easy to get into it. Now, this is where it gets interesting, right? So the entire acquisition of these 2,000 buses in 2 phases by the Delhi government was going to be for standard floor buses. So Nipun said, do you think we can do something about it? So I said, I don't know, it's a policy decision of the government. How do you really do anything about it? The courts are a little reluctant to get into policy matters. So I asked him, I said, do you want to take a chance? So he said, okay, let's take a chance. And we wrote a letter to the managing director of DTC. So DTC is a joint venture in which the Delhi government has a very large holding, and then another government department also has some stake in it. So we wrote to the DTC. They said, sorry, there's nothing we can do. It's a decision by the cabinet. So then we wrote to the chief secretary. The chief secretary, interestingly, at the time, invited us for a cup of tea. So Nipun and I went, and the joke was on us because the building where we were invited to meet him was not accessible. So I went upstairs, requested him. He came downstairs. The chief secretary's assistant met us very nicely, and he said, "Sahab to aaj busy hai, aaj nahi mil sakta hai." So then, disappointed, we left from there. And this happened a few more times. And finally, when we met one of his junior officers, the transport secretary, he sat us down, gave us a cup of tea, heard us out, and said, look, sorry, there's really not much we can do. This is how it's going to be. The budget doesn't allow it in the Delhi government. So dejected, we left from there. So Nipun then said to me that, look, what do we have to lose? Let's try and challenge this in court. I said, all right. I said, I'll take out some time from my regular work. I was then working for the Additional Solicitor General. So we'd finish typically by 7, 8 in the evening, conferences would finish. Came back, Nipun came over, and we did a marathon session of overnight drafting. And in one night, in 4, 5 hours, we had only tea all night, and we drafted this petition. So everything looked okay. We filed the petition. Matter got listed. And I was prepared that this case is going to be thrown out. The judge is going to tell me that, what's wrong with you? There's a policy decision. How can you challenge such a thing? And we were prepared for the worst. And the worst, I thought, was that maybe costs would be imposed against my petitioner. That's the worst that could happen, right? But lo and behold, we went to court. We appeared before the Chief Justice in the Delhi High Court, and notice got issued. So we were as stunned as anybody would be, and we thought maybe it's a fluke. They'll ask the Delhi government a few questions, and that'll be the end of it. And then we'll be, it'll be disposed of. But then this happened. We got a stay on the acquisition of 2,000 regular buses, standard floor buses. And it was, this had never happened before, ever, in the history of Delhi. So the Delhi High Court slammed the government of the day and said, you can't possibly be acquiring these buses that are not accessible for disabled people. Then in the second one, if you see in the Indian Express, it said the Delhi government's request for 1,000 buses. So they came and they bargained with the Chief Justice in court and said, okay, don't let us, we won't buy 2,000, but let us buy 1,000 buses which are standard floor. So again, the Chief Justice, the bench of Justice Hari Krishna and Justice Geeta Mittal came down very heavily on the DTC, Delhi Government and Transport Department, and said nothing doing. Either you buy low floor buses or we're not going to let you buy any buses at all. This went on for some time, and the Delhi and the High Court, the Honorable High Court, finally issued a stay in our favor. And it was a beautiful 70-page order granting interim relief in the form of a stay on the acquisition of all these buses. We were thrilled. Immediately, the Delhi government then moved, challenged it in the Supreme Court. Luckily for us, it came up before a fabulous judge who's also very sensitive about disability rights, Justice Sikri. And Justice Sikri again didn't agree with the Delhi government and said, sorry, the Delhi High Court is right. You have to buy disabled-friendly buses because that's what the law requires. And the Constitution requires it. So coming back to that initial idea that I shared with you when I started this, that, you could get on with the humdrum monotony of whatever, perceived monotony, of whichever area of the law you decide to pick to practice. It could be litigation, it could be corporate law. But within that field, you can certainly carve out some time to do something that is meaningful to you in terms of making a positive difference in your community where you live. And this I believe, and I think we all have the time to really be able to do it. And I think it keeps our soul alive, in this profession especially. Because otherwise it's, the law can really take a lot out of you. And it does fall upon you to preserve, whatever it is that is dear to you. So this was the first story I wanted to share with you. But this was, thank you. That's very, very kind of you. That's very kind of you. But this was a huge win for us, no doubt about it. But it gave us a massive realization that one could do so much more in this profession than just, commercial matters or arguing a bail. And please don't get me wrong, that getting somebody bail, for instance, is one of the most thrilling feelings for anybody as a young practitioner. I mean, you secure someone's liberty. What can be better than that, right? But other than that also, if there is something you can do to add value, it's something that I would encourage all of you to please keep in mind and to consider when you go out there into the legal profession. Please think about it and please do it. Now, one more very interesting thing came out of this judgment, that interim order that came to be upheld by the Supreme Court. Nipun and I were sitting and talking, and now, of course, by this time, he had a very good understanding of Part 3 of the Constitution. He understood what Article 14 is, that bus acquisition had to be done in a way that is not discriminatory and not arbitrary, so he understood 14. Then he understood what 21 is, that in terms of right to life, you can't really insult a person or a group of people and take away their right to life just because they are disabled and so on. So we went through the classic golden triangle, 14, 19, movement, and 21. But then we got this other idea when we were reading, when we were just reading the articles together. We found Article 15. And in Article 15, if you recall, I'm sorry I don't have it on a slide here, but most of you will recall that it prohibits discrimination in all its forms. And in one of the defining, I should say, condition for preventing discrimination there is in terms of place of birth. So it says, you can't be discriminated in terms of your religion, caste, and so on and so forth, but also talks of place of birth. So we extended this idea and we tried to pitch it to the court that in terms of Article 15, even a person with a congenital defect, because place of birth there, we extended it from a mere a place of, like a territoriality into the mother's womb. So, and that was an idea that Justice Mittal really liked. And, she said yes. So in terms of Article 15(2), you also should not be discriminated against, and the state has a duty, a positive obligation to ensure that a policy and spending of resources should be in a manner that is not discriminatory. So this was a new thing we sort of came up with together. So this was one story, and I hope you found it interesting. If you have anything to ask me about it, I'm happy to tell you. And then if not, then I'd like to tell you about something else that we're doing together, and then I'll come to another very interesting story. So after this case got done, Nipun and I teamed up for another few projects. We worked on insurance, on how people with congenital defects are not getting insurance. We got a positive order there. And the latest thing that we've done, the most interesting thing we've done lately, is against Sony Pictures. The international behemoth, Sony Pictures International in the US. So what happened is, Sony Pictures India, which is a subsidiary of Sony Pictures USA, came out with a movie called Aankh Mein Choli. Now this must have been a hit and miss Paresh Rawal film, slapstick comedy. Most of you would not have even heard of this film, called Aankh Mein Choli. Now, when the trailer came out, Nipun called me up and said, look, there's this film, it's really nasty. I said, what do you mean? I said, in India there are a lot of films that are nasty, big deal. He said, no, this is lampooning and, really insulting disabled people for their disabilities. I said, are you sure? I mean, that's really a very scathing indictment of any film, any movie. And I said, Indian courts are very reluctant to be seen to be interfering with freedom of speech and expression. And we have a lot of jurisprudence on this. Bandit Queen, for instance, and all that, in which a casteist slur was used, but then the courts explained that that slur is used to explain something that is wrong in society, and to show it, you have to use it. So I explained it to Nipun. I said, look, this is the law. It's going to be very difficult to challenge this. And it truly was a very insulting trailer. So we got hold of the film. It was on an OTT platform. So we got hold of the film. We saw the film. And what these guys had done is, the producers and the film writers, they had taken not one disability, but 8, and made fun of all 8 disabilities. So for example, a person who couldn't hear or couldn't speak, they referred to him as Atki Hui Cassette, right? Or a person who couldn't walk, they used something Langda for him, or some really, it was crass beyond belief. So I was convinced. Nipun said, let's do this. We moved the High Court, and something very interesting happened there. We filed the petition, matter got listed, and on the day of the hearing, when we were all set, prepared, ready to argue against Sony Pictures, my own senior, I didn't know this, had been engaged by Sony Pictures to argue on the other side. So, and this had never happened before. This is, I've argued against a lot of seniors by now, but never against my own senior, and it's always a little disconcerting, because you've learned from this person. They've taught you. They know your weaknesses. You know their strengths. So it's a little intimidating. It was for me. So, and how it happened is, we were sitting in the Delhi High Court Chief's chamber, and I saw some of Mr. Nadkarni's juniors who came and sat behind me. So this happens very often also. So I turned around and I said, Sir ka kaun sa item hai? So he said, whatever, 4 or something. So then Martin was sitting with me, my junior. He nudged me and he said, sir, that's our item. I said, what? Rubbish. He said, it can't be. How can sir be appearing against us? It must be some other matter. He said, no, it is our matter. It's Sony Pictures. I said, so is he appearing for Sony? He said, yes, he's appearing for Sony. So I had a big dharam sankat. So Mr. Nadkarni walked in, and he's a very larger-than-life personality, if some of you have met him. So he walked in beaming, first thing in the morning, with all of these solicitors from a solicitor's firm in Bombay that had engaged him. Very large, Nishit Desai. So I walked up to him. Court was, of course, not in session yet. I touched his feet. I said, good morning, sir. How are you? He said, good morning to me. And I said, sir, are you appearing in item 4? He said, yeah, I'm appearing in item 4. I said, sir, but I'm for the petitioner. He said, yeah, that's okay. So what? I said, sir, I can't appear against you. He said, what rubbish? Of course you have to appear against me and do your best. So I said, okay. So then, took permission in a sense, went to my corner, very shaken up, intimidated, got ready, and the matter got called out. Full credit to the judge and to Mr. Nadkarni, who's a very aggressive lawyer, did not interrupt me even once. I was allowed to argue 10, 15, 20 minutes. I argued, made my case. The Honorable Chief Justice in the Delhi High Court didn't agree with us and said, no, we will not enter into this domain of free speech and expression. And we've laid down some principles in not only this film, Bandit Queen, but Bandit Queen's principles had also been upheld later in Delhi 6, which is that film with Sonam Kapoor and, thank you, with that. So in that also some term had been used which was considered offensive. So that had also come to be challenged, and carving out that, a very nice judgment. Of course, we disagreed with that position, but that judgment came into being. Dejected, I went back to Nipun and I said, I'm sorry, I didn't know this, I didn't know this would happen, and we really did our best. We fought. And Mr. Nadkarni was, I have to say this on record, enormously gracious. And he could have, he's an aggressive lawyer, as I said. He could have stopped us, interrupted me, heckled us, did none of that. But the bench was with him. And it happens sometimes that the bench is with the other side, so it happened. Now, a few weeks went by, And now those of you who've interned in the Supreme Court know that to file an SLP, when you get a bad order in the High Court or whichever court, there's a limitation. So time was running out. I was feeling down about it. Nipun was feeling down about it. Morale was certainly down in our camp. But we believed that yes, this is something wrong, and some guidelines are required because the press law, the Film Act doesn't have, Cinematograph Act doesn't have any guidelines on regulating such films. So we filed a petition in the Supreme Court. Matter came up this time before the Honorable Chief Justice, Justice Chandrachud. And so we thought, I assumed again, wrongly this time, that again Mr. Nadkarni will be engaged to appear, but he was not available, and another bevy of senior counsels had been engaged on the other side. One better than the other, because again, high stakes issue. And I'm sure the Sony Pictures and Sony Pictures India were emboldened by this time that we got it knocked off in the High Court. We'll certainly manage her as well. Matter came up, and Justice Chandrachud was listening to it, asked us the same questions, grilled us, said, well, free speech, this, that, and the other. And we kept trying to push the point that no, it's extremely offensive. Even the trailer is offensive. So he said, all right, let's watch the trailer. So in the Chief Justice's courtroom, in court number 1 in the Supreme Court, they asked to see the trailer. So it was, I think, again, Martin, who gave the link to the court master. And now if you've gone to the Supreme Court recently, there are these large screens in court now, very high tech. And you have this massive screen right in front of the Honorable, where the judges sit, in front of the chief. There's this massive screen right above the door. So this trailer was played to the entire audience. And it's a really crass, really crass trailer for those whatever 1 minute it played. And the entire thing played out. And they looked at each other and they said, we're issuing notice. There's something seriously wrong with this. This can't be. And we were completely stunned. And it happened again. So now the latest in that is it came to be argued a few times. It's been reserved for judgment. We're very hopeful that something positive will come out of it. And the indication we've been given is that some guidelines, the Honorable Chief Justice is going to come up with some guidelines to regulate how these films which portray the disabled are going to come up. And in the course of that hearing, Nipun was of course attending it as well. He was in court. He said something very beautiful which I'll always remember. And as I said, I opened by, when I introduced him to you, I said that I learned a lot from him about life and about dealing with challenges or about using your time to do more meaningful things than just make money or acquiring power. And he took permission to address the bench. Now credit to Justice, Honorable the Chief Justice, he said, yes, you can say something as well. And he explained to the bench and said that I have no difficulty with a disabled person being made fun of. So the chief was also a little confused. He said, but don't make fun of the disability. Make fun of the situation that that person is in. So that he recorded in his interim order before reserving the judgment. So, and giving him credit that Nipun Malhotra has said. So it was a good feeling. So in the middle of doing foreign asset seizures, which is my bread and butter under the PMLA, doing a partition suit for somebody else, a bail, which I do a lot of. In the middle of all that, you have these, in that interstitial space, you have these few matters that you do which keeps your gut alive and your core, your spirit alive. So I'm encouraging all of you to please try and also think about that. I have another one more very interesting story that, go back. So this second story is more interesting, more high stakes, and I must tell you something very interesting about it also, in the sense that I might want to maybe write a screenplay about what I'm going to tell you next. It's very interesting. So 2 years ago, I had a client walk in, and she had a partition suit. So very vanilla, very normal thing for us civil lawyers, litigators to do, a normal partition suit. We did it, we got a relief. She came in for another conference after that. And then we were just talking, and she works for one of the big four. And we were talking about the lack of probity in public lending institutions in India. And as I said, her matter had already been discussed. So, it's always interesting to learn from your clients and to get another perspective. So as we were chatting, she said that someone in her own organization, who did not want to be named, had chanced upon a report in which there was a detailed forensic analysis about one of the largest erstwhile automotive component companies in India, a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate with holdings across the world. And what she told us next was mind-blowing for me. She said that this report has indicated that about 6 to 7,000 crores of public funds have been siphoned away, taken from banks by this entity, and then through shell entities siphoned out of India and whatever. The promoters have stolen this money. So we said, well, of course, I'm sure this is before NCLT now, because this company went to NCLT and assets of about 15,000 crores were sold for about 680 crores, at a massive haircut, to a private equity firm in the US called Liberty International. So this chapter had been written about, the matter was done. So I said, but this is what's happened. So clearly the courts have looked at it, NCLT is seized of it, and under the Companies Act you have the SFIO, they can look at it. I'm sure someone, this is what I said, I'm sure someone is looking at it. And I couldn't have been more wrong. So this client of ours, she took time from us, came back again to meet us, and this time she came with the report. So we were stunned. She actually brought that forensic report, which was highly confidential. We went through it. Some parts we understood. Some parts were complex accounting we did not understand. So we went to a chartered accountant firm, friend of ours, who knows all of these things. And we sat with that gentleman, a good old Mr. Agarwal, brilliant, 40 years of practice as a chartered accountant. And his jaw dropped and he said, "Ye aapko kahan se mili hai?" He's from Varanasi originally, but now he's set up practice in Delhi. So he's a little rustic. He said, "Aapko ye report kahan se mili hai?" I said, "Nahi, koi whistleblower client hai, unhone aake humko di hai ye report." So he said, "Ye to तहलका हो जाएगा इस रिपोर्ट से, इसमें तो एविडेंस है कि शेल कंपनीज बना के और ड्राइवर पीएन को डायरेक्टर बना के दिखा के क्रॉस लिंकेजेस में पैसा निकाला गया है." And then of course he explained the nitty-gritties of how they did it, fake supplying firms and this and that. So we sat with him for 6 hours, we understood it all, and we went back and we thought, well, this is a little dangerous, ambitious and so on. And we had another meeting with that client and we said, "We'd like to meet your whistleblower friend." So she said, "There's no way that person's going to meet. They're scared for their life. They don't want to meet." So we said, "Can you set up a VC call in which their identity is hidden? We won't know who they are, and you can set it up and so on." So we had a call with this person. We were sitting in our chamber. They were wherever they were. And we discussed the entire thing. And it turned out that they were very interested, in fact, in doing something about it. And the IRP that had been appointed, and most of you are familiar with the IBC, right? I'm sure. So the IRP had then come to had been appointed the RP, was somebody that this whistleblower had worked with and had been, whatever their equation may have been, but she had discovered widespread bribery between the RP and this promoter family, and she wanted to have some action taken against them. So we said, "Look, we can write to the regulatory authorities. That's the first step. Let's file a complaint, a well-researched, well-documented complaint with the Chartered Accountant's report." A long story short, she agreed with some assurances. We sent those complaints. No response came from the agencies, neither ED, SFIO, CBI, nobody wrote back. So we said, okay, again, nobody's written. So then we said the next step is to file a petition. So she said, all right, let's do this. So concealing her identity and in the name of a lawyer, we filed this petition. And this came up before in the Honorable Supreme Court, before Justice Lalit, when he was Chief Justice. He had a very brief tenure as Chief Justice, so it came up before him. Now, when the matter came up, I had the great privilege to appear in that matter, and it was a Vineet Narayan moment for me. And I remember telling Justice Lalit this, and for 25 minutes he grilled us. He grilled me, he said, "Who's your petitioner? Does he have some private interest in this? Who's the whistleblower?" We said, "We'll give it in sealed cover." And this went on for about 20-25 minutes. We answered all his questions. And he too was stunned. He said, "Look, has no one taken any action in this?" He said, No one's taken any action. And we estimated the figure of siphoning to be about 6,000 crores, give or take. And we filed everything with the bench. Now, little did we know, and this is how life is so interesting, and which is why I encourage you to take these chances and to do these interesting things and meet new people. One of the court reporters that day in the Supreme Court, her friend turned out to be one of the reporters at the Economic Times on the financial side, investigative reporter. So she must have gone and told this person that, "Look, this very interesting matter came up today involving this entity. This is what they discussed, this is what happened, and this is what the court said, and notice has been issued in it." So this court reporter then gets in touch with me and asks me for my permission whether she can share our details with this other friend of hers, I said, okay, sure. I speak to this person. He comes and meets us. And it turns out that for the last 6 months, unbeknownst to us, he had also been doing an independent investigation on the promoters of this group. So he came and met us, and in confidence we showed him our research, our report. He showed us his research, his report. And then we said, look, do you mind if we file this on an affidavit before the court? It will only help the case. Because he had figured out that in Delhi, these promoters had gotten one office in a Lal Dora area. And in that one office on 4 floors, some 65 companies had been registered. So he'd done all the research on that. The driver, peon, I mean, you name it. You know, it was all basically their own people who were managing these different companies, all registered in the same address. So we said, okay, we'll do this. We took his material, got an affidavit made and sealed cover, took permission, filed the matter before the Honorable Chief Justice and in court. So the same day, when this journalist was going back home to his home in Noida, he got attacked. And the hearing had been televised, it had been reported by then. So some people with masks on his way to Noida came and assaulted him in his vehicle, stopped his car, they were on bikes and they assaulted him, beat him up quite badly. So the next morning, same evening he called me up and he said, look, this has happened, we need to do something about it. So the next morning, we just walked straight into the chief's court during mentioning and very politely sought permission, mentioned it before the Honorable Chief Justice. He was very, very perturbed by it. And he straight away said that please call the Attorney General. So I thought maybe he meant the Advocate General for the state of UP, because he had also asked for the AG of UP. So I said, Your Lordship wants the Advocate General, you mean? No, he says, the Attorney General. Call the Attorney General. I said, okay, at lunch. So went to Mr. Venkatramani, told him that, the Chief Justice is called. These are the papers. He said, what have you boys done? He says to me. He said, nothing, this is the matter and so on. Matter comes up at 2 p.m. Matter is called out. And of course, Justice Lalit, he's, one of the nicest, most well-spoken judges that I've also had the privilege of appearing before. He straight away asked the Attorney General to ensure that security is provided to the journalist. And immediately, just like that, an order was dictated. And the Commissioner of Police of Noida was directed to provide 24-hour protection to that journalist. And that line I will never forget. Please go back. And that line I will never forget. The line was in that order granting protection. He says, this journalist is in the pursuit of the truth. And therefore this court will ensure that every protection required to get to the truth will be given to him. And that came to be recorded in the order. Now this was 2 years ago, right? And then in the meantime, directions were given to the agencies to start their investigations, SFIO separately, ED and CBI separately. And this happened, if you could go to the next one, thank you. This happened now, just a few days ago. Raids have happened across 35 locations. And our initial estimate of 6,500 crores was revised to 20,000 crores. We thought there were 100 shell entities through which siphoning had happened. It turned out there are more than 500 shell entities that are created. So every estimate that we had turned out to be wrong. And now it's before another bench. It's not before the chief anymore, but before another very senior bench of the Honorable Supreme Court. And they've, of course, been grilling the agencies. And an amicus also came to be appointed in this matter. And I'll never forget that line while the matter was being argued, where the amicus laughingly said, Mr. Gulati, a thorough gentleman, Mr. Kavan Gulati, he said the petitioners the estimates of the petitioners are all wrong. So I looked at him, and the judges looked at me and looked at him. He said, yes, they thought it's 6,000 crores, it's 20,000 crores. So it was a great moment of reckoning, that no matter who you are, you could be a first-generation lawyer, you could think of yourself as being powerless, weak, not having connections, and so on. Whatever the blockages are in your own mind, you can overcome those blockages. You can go beyond the monotony of your everyday job, practice, and whatever. And you can pursue goals and causes that are close to your heart. The only question is, are you willing to take the initiative to do it? And I would like to encourage you that please don't take the regular routine, way in life, but please try and do something with your knowledge and skill to make a difference and to improve things for other people also, right? And this was all public money, 20,000 crores of public funds. And I remember my junior at the time, in whose name we filed the petition, Jaskaran Chawla, when we were still debating initially whether to file this petition or not, he said, "Sir, to get a car loan, it is so difficult. You have to give this as collateral, that as collateral. But how do these billionaires get these loans?" And that triggered it for us. That, why should these billionaires get away with siphoning not a few hundred, but 20,000 crores of public funds have been siphoned. So this was a great experience. I want to tell you this, that this profession gives you enormous freedom. It allows you the room and the space to build a life that is extremely meaningful. And of course, through that, the ability to do good for yourself and, for people around you. And which brings me to the last part of what I wanted to share with you. And I won't take more than 2 minutes. If I've gone if I've gotten carried away, I'm sorry, but I'll conclude very quickly. And this is something that is close to my heart, so I'll take only a few minutes. So here's the question. I want to leave you with some ideas. How do you chart a course for the future as young professionals in a way that it is meaningful for you, that in a way that it equips you to pursue the goals that are close to your heart, while also, of course, addressing the responsibilities that your family might have for you and, your own dreams, because I know that a legal education isn't cheap these days. And some of you will do an LLM. There's a lot of, some loans to be paid off and things like that. But here's what I'm going to say. For those of you here who already know what you want to do in life, you are rare and unique and obviously brilliant. And I would only say this to you, that sharpen your focus further in that area and give it water and sunlight, and that area will grow. But if you were anything like me when I was a young law student, when I graduated from law school, I really didn't know what I wanted to do immediately when I was still in my 4th or 5th year of law school. I had no idea. But I knew, of course, I wanted to be in the law, as it were. So I did a few strange things, and I'll tell you very quickly. I started at a large law firm. I worked there for a while, went to the US, did my master's, worked at a firm there, and then gave it all up after I got on to partner track after a year. And my parents thought, middle class, parents, they thought I'm completely nuts. They thought I need to visit a psychiatrist because I wanted to quit my life in the US after earning my credentials there and come back to India. And not to join a firm in India. I came back to then do a clerkship in the Supreme Court. So I did the reverse of what most people do. They do a clerkship, then they go abroad, and then they get into big law. So I did that, and it was fabulous for me. 14 months I spent with Justice Bobde. He gave me a lot of intellectual room to give him suggestions in his judgments and to discuss ideas with him. But the greatest takeaway there was that the sheer volume of matters I got to look at, thousands upon thousands in those 14 months, because as you know, Monday and Friday are the days when senior counsels make 1 crore a day, right? So you have 100 SLPs, 50, 80 SLPs before a particular bench. But the great thing is that Justice Bobde then was a junior judge. So he had to do all the reading, which meant his clerks had to prepare all the notes. So we went through massive volumes of matters in different areas. After doing that, I wasn't still done. I then went and joined a large media conglomerate and went to work for a media baron as his legal consultant, which is basically a glorified term for a secretary, right? And so, but this 8-month stint with this person gave me a bird's eye view into how a large media conglomerate is run, how those decisions are taken at the top, how problem solving is done by corporate giants and so on. So that gave me a lot of experience as well. And after doing all of that, I got back into litigation. So the idea is that there is no one size that fits all of you. There's no cookie cutter approach that you should take to this. Do whatever you're interested in and be present fully in doing that, and then please pursue it. There are no wrong answers as long as you're there. And the last thing, if you come to the last slide, I have only 5. Yes, please.
Yeah. So what made you come back?
From that?
Give up the US partnership.
From the US? Thank you for that question, sir. So this firm I was at was Klein and Spector. They're the largest pharmaceutical mass tort firm. So they sue companies like Johnson & Johnson. And in fact, the named partners of the firm, Shannon Spector and Tom Klein, one of them was my professor at Penn. So he recruited me straight out of law school. And I learned a lot from him. But their practice in rural Pennsylvania was basically when you would sue these large firms, like Johnson & Johnson and so on, you would appear before a jury in rural Pennsylvania. And my understanding by then was this, that as a brown man with a very pronounced Indian accent, I would not be very successful before white American conservative juries. Sir knows you were in New York in the late 60s. So therefore, I understood that. And second, my dream and passion was always to go back to India and litigate. So my folks weren't convinced.
I asked that question because I wanted to know what was different 40 years later in
Oh,
America.
wow. That I would love to know from sir. I was trying to ask during lunch.
Why I asked that question
Yeah.
because we have one story. I wanted to know why you did it.
So the honest answer, I mean, the really, the attractive answer is, well, I was interested in coming back and setting up my practice here. But the real truth also was in the back of my mind that in litigation as a trial lawyer in America, appearing before rural juries, it wouldn't have, I would have had to get my skin bleached or something. I mean, it wouldn't have worked. So then I decided that it was time to come back. But
What about moving to another part of America, California, say?
I should have done, I could have considered that. I should, I think if I get a do-over, then this is, and California, yes, because one of my favorite shows on OTT is that Mickey Holler show, Lincoln Lawyer. So that's based in LA. So, you know, he's also a criminal lawyer and so on, which is a great show. You should all watch it. But that brings me to the last part of what I wanted to share with you. 5 ideas or tips that have worked for me so far. And this is a little different than the usual stuff. So very quickly. 1, please protect your mental health. That's your own responsibility. And you have to take charge of it. You have to figure out what keeps you emotionally balanced, because this is a very, very demanding profession. And when I say that, I'm saying this specifically to all of you because you've been picked from amongst the best. So if you're intellectually very driven, if you are ambitious and competitive, and in this profession you have to be all of those things if you want to be successful, and if your own emotional state isn't very healthy, and if you can't manage those issues, then you'll have a tough time. So my suggestion is, what works for me is you should try and avoid toxic situations, toxic people, and physical movement. I mean, that really works for me. If you can make it a part of your own lifestyle, nothing like it. So for me, you know, things like boxing, swimming, right, spending time with my dog Henry, whom I take for a walk in the evening, all of that really works for me, which brings me to point 2. Become the masters of your time and always show up. By that I mean that I swear by Google Calendars. I feel that if you can master your time, and no matter what the situation is, if you're unwell and if a client is counting on you or if a friend is counting on you, you need to be somewhere. If you're unwell, if you're sick, take a medicine, take steam like I have done today, but be there. You have to show up, you know. And as I said, Google Calendar really works very well for me. I block my week ahead in Google Calendar. In fact, I even block my, when I take my dog for a walk, and if there's a conference, and if a conference spills over to that time I've allotted to walk my dog, if the client is, in most cases, if it's not a pressing issue or something very urgent, even my clients don't mind if I step out for half an hour, get some fresh air and come back, my mind works better. So I'm sure that's something that most of us can incorporate. The third thing, work. How do you get better at it? My suggestion is, you're all SEC ambassadors. You have access to the finest legal resources in this country, both in terms of case law and in terms of reference material. So my suggestion is that you find an area of the law, if you haven't yet already, figure it out and try and master it. Read, even commit an hour a day if you can, out of your very busy schedules. If you can commit even an hour a day in reading about that area of the law, sure enough, in a year or 2, you will have read pretty much most of the material there is out there in that area. And it works very well. It's like compound interest. You keep reading and you never know when it will come to your aid. In a client conference, while you're briefing a senior, in court, you never know when it will help. 4th, don't make the mistake of chasing money for the sake of it in this profession. Which takes me back to the theme of my entire discussion, that chase satisfaction. And you will find satisfaction when you do meaningful work. And meaningful work, of course, also means taking care of your paying clients and your firms and your seniors. But within all of that, find meaning in terms of what you do. Money, power, recognition are byproducts. They automatically come to you once you start excelling at your work. And so therefore, please chase meaningful work and nothing else. And lastly, very cliched, but perhaps the most important. There's some very senior people sitting here, and they will perhaps agree with me. In this profession, what takes you the farthest is not how well you speak, your connections, or even your legal brilliance or your knowledge, but it is your reputation and integrity. If your reputation and integrity are solid, no one should be able to buy you out in any definition of that term. Then you have a solid, guaranteed future in this profession. So, thank you. And thank you.